Gabrielle, you're back, Ethan said with a grin as I walked into my office at the museum. His overly casual tone immediately set off alarm bells. The way he leaned against my antique mahogany desk, amid the carefully arranged exhibition catalogs and artifact photographs, felt invasive. I replied cautiously, setting down my portfolio of curated pieces. Something about his smug expression, so out of place among the refined surroundings of the museum's curatorial wing, didn't sit right with me. What's with the smile? Oh, nothing, he said, waving his hand dismissively at the framed certificates and degrees on my wall. Then, with a flourish that seemed rehearsed, he added, well, I suppose you'll find out eventually. I made a major business move while you were away at the symposium. I raised an eyebrow, my hand instinctively moving to the antique pendant at my throat, a piece from my grandmother's collection that I'd worn to every major exhibition opening. What kind of move? He leaned back further against my desk, causing several carefully arranged authentication documents to scatter. His grin widened, and there was something predatory in his expression that made my skin crawl. Your jewelry collection, he said, his voice dripping with self-satisfaction. I sold it. Every piece. And before you get upset, let me just say you'll thank me later. Your jewels funded my startup's expansion. We're talking Series B funding levels now, baby. I froze, my curator's mind immediately cataloging every piece in my collection, the Art Deco rings passed down through generations, the vintage brooches I'd authenticated myself, the family heirlooms that told our history. My heart pounded as his words sank in. Years of carefully preserved history, pieces I'd professionally valued and personally treasured, gone. What did you just say? I asked, my voice low and trembling with the kind of controlled fury I usually reserved for detecting forgeries. Ethan laughed, clearly misreading my tone for the professional arts curator I was. I said I sold it, Gabrielle. Do you know how much those pieces were worth on the private market? Enough to give my tech venture the boost it needed. It's brilliant, really. You should be proud your little collection is funding the future. Proud? My hands clenched into fists, years of handling delicate artifacts the only thing keeping me from throwing something. You had no right, Ethan. That was my private collection. Do you even realize what you've done? He rolled his eyes, the gesture making him look like every overconfident startup founder I'd ever met. Oh, come on. It's not like you wore most of it. They were just gathering dust in that fancy safe of yours. This way they're actually contributing to something meaningful, real innovation, not just some old rocks in boxes. If there's one thing I've learned in my years as a museum curator, it's that value isn't always obvious to the untrained eye. When I met Ethan, I admired his drive to innovate, his big dreams of changing the tech world. But over the years, I started to see the cracks in his polished Silicon Valley veneer, how his charm masked a tendency to bulldoze anyone who got in his way. Still, I never thought he'd stoop this low. The jewelry collection wasn't just valuable, it was a carefully curated piece of my family's history, each item authenticated and documented with the same care I gave to museum pieces. What Ethan didn't know, what made his smug startup founder grin so infuriating, was that I wasn't as careless with provenance as he thought. Each piece in my collection had been professionally documented, photographed, and registered in international art databases. And a few months ago, after a series of high-profile art thefts, I'd taken additional precautions. My most valuable pieces had been fitted with the same tracking devices we used for museum loans. I forced myself to stay calm, drawing on years of experience handling priceless artifacts with steady hands. Ethan thought he'd made a smart business move, but he had no idea he was dealing with someone who'd spent their career tracking down lost treasures and exposing forgeries. That night, I sat in my home office, staring at the empty display cases where my collection had been housed. Each velvet-lined box had been carefully chosen to protect its contents, and now they sat bare, like empty exhibits in my own personal museum. The anger bubbling inside me was almost too much to contain. As a curator, I'd dealt with art theft before, but this was different. This wasn't just about monetary value. These were pieces of my family's history, each with its own story and provenance. The sapphire ring my grandmother had worn while curating at the Metropolitan, the Art Deco bracelet my mother had passed down on my first day as a curator. Even the vintage pendant I'd authenticated myself at the beginning of my career, each piece was a milestone in my family's connection to the art world. And Ethan had treated them like startup capital. My fingers hovered over my specialized tracking software, the same system we used to monitor traveling exhibitions. I wanted to confront him immediately, document the theft like I would any museum piece that had gone missing. But 15 years in the art world had taught me patience. Instead, I opened the tracking program we used for high-value loans. The screen lit up with a map of the city, little red dots scattered across various auction houses and private dealers. My breath caught as I realized they were all still active. The Art Deco necklace was at Fletcher's, an auction house I knew well. The diamond bracelet had moved to a private dealer's showroom in the financial district. The app even showed timestamps and transaction records, tracking the journey of my collection as it was dispersed through the high-end art market. A grim satisfaction replaced my anger as I recognized several names in the transaction logs, dealers I'd worked with who would be more than willing to cooperate with a respected curator. If the tracking data was accurate and I'd verified this system myself for museum use, I could not only locate my pieces but also document every illegal sale. I picked up my phone and called Autumn, my fellow curator and closest friend since graduate school. "Autumn," I said as soon as she answered, "you're not going to believe what Ethan did." "What's the tech genius done now?" she asked, the sarcasm in her voice telling me she was still in her office at the Modern Art Wing. I explained everything: the unauthorized sale, his smug attitude, the tracking system. By the time I finished, her curator's methodical calm had given way to pure outrage. "Gabrielle, you need to call Detective Nash," she said firmly. "He handled that gallery theft last month. He'll know exactly how to approach this." "I will," I said, my curatorial instincts for documentation already kicking in. "First thing tomorrow. I'm gathering all the provenance records tonight." I ended the call and sat back, watching the glowing dots move across my screen like exhibits being relocated. Ethan had no idea he'd just triggered the same security protocols we used to protect priceless artifacts. For once, I felt like my professional expertise had given me the upper hand. The next morning, I walked into the police station, my curator's portfolio tucked under my arm. Inside were detailed provenance records, authentication certificates, and tracking data, everything I'd need to document a major art theft. I'd never had to report my own husband for stealing my collection, but years of handling art crime cases had prepared me for this moment. Detective Nash greeted me with a look of recognition. "Miss Crawford," he said, motioning me to his desk. "I didn't expect to see you so soon after the Morgan Gallery case." "I need to report a theft," I said, slipping into my professional tone. "A private collection this time." His eyebrows rose slightly as I placed my portfolio on his desk. "Your collection?" "Yes," I replied, opening the carefully organized documentation. "My personal jewelry collection was sold without my consent. And I have tracking data on several pieces." The detective's expression shifted from polite interest to serious concern as I laid out the evidence. When I showed him the tracking app displaying real-time locations of my pieces, his professional demeanor intensified. "This is impressive documentation," he said, examining the authentication certificates. If these tracking devices are active and the provenance is verified, we have a solid case. Do you have a detailed inventory? I pulled out a meticulously catalogued list of every piece, complete with photographs and appraised values. Each item was documented with the same precision I demanded for museum acquisitions. Detective Nash read through the entries, his expression growing more serious with each page. The sapphire ring, circa 1940, with documented provenance from the Metropolitan Museum's former curator. The Art Deco bracelet with original Cartier certificates. This is an extensively documented collection, Ms. Crawford. It's more than documentation, I said, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. Each piece has been authenticated and registered in international art databases. I can prove ownership and track current locations. Detective Nash looked up from his notes, his expression resolute. With this level of documentation and active tracking, we can move quickly. However, since your husband sold these pieces without consent, this also constitutes fraud. Are you prepared to press charges? I thought of Ethan's smug smile, his casual dismissal of my collection's significance. Yes, I said, drawing on the same determination I used when exposing forgeries. I want him held accountable. Nash nodded, already reaching for his phone. Let's start with the auction houses. Your reputation in the art world should help expedite cooperation. As I left the station, I felt a complex mix of emotions, relief that my professional expertise was working in my favor, anger at Ethan's betrayal, and most of all, determination. I'd spent my career protecting and recovering valuable artifacts. Now I was using those same skills to reclaim my own history. By the time I returned home, the adrenaline from filing the police report had started to fade, leaving me with a mix of exhaustion and heightened awareness, the same feeling I got after authenticating a particularly challenging piece. I replayed my conversation with Detective Nash, mentally cataloging each step like I would an artifact's provenance. The thought of Ethan's inevitable reaction made my stomach turn. In the tech startup world he inhabited, he was used to spinning failures into pivots and setbacks into learning experiences. But this time, his usual Silicon Valley rhetoric wouldn't save him. That evening, Autumn came over, a bottle of wine in hand, the same kind we used to share during late nights in graduate school, poring over authentication texts. All right, she said, settling onto my sofa. Walk me through everything. How did it go with Nash? I detailed the meeting, from the tracking data to Nash's response, watching her expression shift between professional interest and personal outrage, the same way we both reacted to particularly egregious forgery cases. You're handling this with more composure than I would, she said, her voice carrying the measured tone we used in gallery discussions. If my husband tried to liquidate my collection, I'd be documenting a very different kind of crime scene. I managed a laugh despite myself. The police have the tracking data, and Nash thinks that's our best shot at recovery. It's like that Degas recovery case last spring. Follow the piece, document the chain of custody. Good, Autumn said, raising her glass. To bringing down tech brothers who think family heirlooms are startup capital. The next morning, my phone lit up with a call from Detective Nash. Ms. Crawford, he began, his tone carrying the same gravity he used when discussing high-profile art recoveries. We've verified the locations of the tracked items. 2 are at Fletcher's auction house, and another is in a private dealer's showroom. We've secured cooperation from both establishments. I should mention, though, we've found some concerning patterns in your husband's business transactions. My curator's instinct for spotting irregularities kicked in. What kind of patterns? There are unusual transfers linked to his startup's accounts, Nash explained. The timeline overlaps with your jewelry sales, but there's more. We're seeing evidence of questionable tech valuations and potential investor fraud. This could be bigger than the unauthorized sale of your collection. As I ended the call, my mind raced with the implications. Ethan hadn't just betrayed my trust, he might have been running his startup the same way forgers ran their operations, with smoke, mirrors, and a lot of misplaced confidence. Later that evening, the idea that Ethan's deception could extend beyond my collection haunted me as I worked in my home office, methodically documenting every transaction I could find. Like analyzing the brush strokes of a suspected forgery, each financial record revealed more inconsistencies. When I heard his key in the door, I was ready. He strolled into my office like he owned it, just as he'd done at the museum. "Long day at the incubator," he announced, then noticed my expression. "What's with the serious curator face?" "We need to talk, Ethan," I said, using the same tone I used when confronting dealers about questionable provenance. "The police are investigating you." The color drained from his face, but he quickly attempted to recover. "Police? What are you talking about?" "My jewelry collection," I said, keeping my voice steady. "The pieces you sold without consent. And now they're looking into your startup's finances." His startup founder confidence wavered, replaced by something harder. "You went to the police," he hissed. "Do you have any idea what you've done? This could tank our next funding round." "R. There is no R here, Ethan. You stole my authenticated pieces to prop up your questionable venture funding. And now Detective Nash is finding interesting patterns in your accounts." "It was a strategic reallocation of assets," he snapped, falling back on his startup jargon. "I was scaling our family's potential. Why couldn't you just trust my vision like a supportive wife?" "Because I'm not just your wife," I replied, my voice carrying the authority I'd earned through years in the art world. "I'm a curator who documents and protects valuable pieces. Did you really think I wouldn't have my collection tracked and authenticated?" His expression shifted, anger flashing in his eyes. "You tracked the pieces? You've ruined everything. My investors - your investors should be more concerned about the irregularities in your business practices," I cut in. "This isn't a pitch deck you can edit, Ethan. The evidence is already documented." He stared at me, his tech empire bravado crumbling. "You've made a huge mistake," he said finally, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "You have no idea how this works in the tech world." "No, Ethan," I said calmly, "you had no idea how things work in my world. In art authentication, we have a saying, the truth always shows in the details." He stormed out of my office, slamming the door behind him. I sat there for a long time, surrounded by my documentation and records, feeling the weight of years of deception finally lifting. The next morning, I received another call from Detective Nash. "Ms. Crawford," he began, his voice carrying the same assured tone he used when closing major art fraud cases. "We've recovered 3 of your documented pieces, including the Art Deco bracelet and sapphire ring. Fletcher's auction house has been particularly cooperative. Your reputation in the industry certainly helped." Relief washed over me like the feeling after authenticating a long-lost masterpiece. "Thank you, Detective," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "What about the investigation into Ethan's business?" "The financial records tied to his startup show concerning patterns," Nash explained. "We're seeing evidence of inflated valuations, misrepresented investment reports, and potential wire fraud. Your jewelry sales appear to be just the tip of the iceberg." I thanked Detective Nash and ended the call, the weight of Ethan's deception settling heavily. Like a forged painting that reveals more flaws under scrutiny, his carefully constructed image was crumbling. That afternoon, I met with Iris Bennett, a lawyer Autumn had recommended who specialized in both art law and financial recovery. In her office, surrounded by leather-bound law books, I laid out my case as methodically as I would present an artifact's provenance. "This is quite a situation," she said, reviewing my documentation. "But you've done everything right: the tracking data, the authentication records, the police reports. We can file for divorce and begin securing your assets immediately." The word divorce hit me like the discovery of a forgery in a trusted collection, both shocking and somehow inevitable. It wasn't until later that evening, sitting in my home office surrounded by empty display cases, that I fully processed how much had changed. Autumn called to check in, her voice carrying the warmth of years of friendship. "How are you holding up, Gabrielle?" "I'm okay," I said, surprising myself with the truth in those words. For the first time since this started, I feel like I'm back in control. It's like finally exposing a sophisticated forgery, painful, but necessary. "That's my girl," Autumn said with approval. "You've always been better at spotting fakes than anyone I know." As I hung up, I looked at the documentation spread across my desk. The road ahead would be challenging, but I'd spent my career protecting valuable pieces of history. Now it was time to protect myself. 2 days later, I met Detective Nash at the station to review the investigation's progress. His office reminded me of my own workspace, methodically organized files and evidence photos replacing my usual collection documentation. "Miss Crawford," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "We've traced nearly all your pieces through various high-end auction houses and private dealers. The art community's cooperation has been exceptional. Your professional reputation has been invaluable." "That's a relief," I said, feeling the same satisfaction as when completing a major authentication project. "And Ethan?" Nash leaned forward, his expression serious. "The evidence against him is substantial. Between the unauthorized sale of your authenticated collection and the fraud we've uncovered in his startup's operations, the DA is preparing multiple charges. His fake it till you make it approach to business isn't going to work in court." That evening, Ethan came home late. I was in my office, surrounded by legal documents and banking records, each one organized with the same precision I used for exhibition catalogs. He stopped in the doorway, his usual startup swagger notably absent. "What is all this?" he asked, gesturing at the papers. "Divorce filings," I replied evenly, not looking up from the document I was reviewing. "My lawyer specializes in art law and financial fraud." His eyes widened, genuine shock breaking through his carefully maintained CEO facade. "You're divorcing me?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual pitch-meeting confidence. "Yes, Ethan," I said, meeting his gaze with the same steady look I used when confirming a forgery. "This is the end. I won't let you treat my life's work like seed funding." He scoffed, running a hand through his carefully styled hair. "You think you'll come out of this unscathed? Everything I did was for us, for our future. I was building an empire." "You built it on lies," I said, my voice carrying the certainty of years of authentication work. "You stole my collection, misled your investors, and treated my expertise like it was worthless. This empire was always about your ego." He stared at me, his startup founder confidence crumbling like poorly forged provenance. "You don't mean this," he said finally, his voice uncertain. "We can pivot, restructure. This isn't one of your pitch decks, Ethan," I cut in. "You'll be served tomorrow." For the first time since I'd known him, he had no response. He turned and left, the sound of the door echoing through the house. I exhaled slowly, looking around my office. This wasn't just the end of my marriage, it was the beginning of reclaiming my professional and personal integrity. The next morning, I got a call from Iris. "Gabrielle, the papers have been filed. Ethan will be served today," she said, her voice carrying the same assurance I used when verifying an artifact's authenticity. I took a deep breath, feeling like I'd just completed a major authentication project. "Thank you," I said softly. "Gabrielle, I know this is challenging," she added, her tone professional but understanding. "But you've handled this with the same precision you bring to your curatorial work. Stay focused on the documentation and recovery, we're here to support you." After the call, I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee, gazing at the empty display cases that once held my collection. For weeks, my life had felt like examining a sophisticated forgery, each day revealing new layers of deception. But now, there was clarity. My pieces were being recovered, the investigation was progressing, and the divorce filings marked a clean break from Ethan's world of smoke and mirrors. That afternoon, Detective Nash called with updates. "Miss Crawford, I wanted to inform you that charges are being formally filed against your husband. The combination of unauthorized sale of your authenticated collection and the financial fraud in his startup operations has resulted in multiple counts." Relief washed over me like successfully recovering a lost masterpiece. "Does this mean I'll be able to reclaim everything he sold?" "It's looking very positive," Nash replied. "The evidence is solid, and the art community has been remarkably cooperative. But more importantly, justice is being served." "Thank you," I said, my voice steady. When I hung up, I realized something profound. I wasn't angry anymore. The curator in me had processed, documented, and cataloged the betrayal. Now I was ready for restoration. That evening, I met Autumn for dinner at our favorite restaurant near the museum. She raised her glass with a knowing smile. "To Gabrielle," she said, "the woman who curates her life as expertly as she does her exhibitions." I laughed, clinking my glass against hers. "I wouldn't go that far yet, but I'm getting there." Autumn leaned forward, her expression serious. "You're stronger than you think, Gabrielle. You approached this whole mess like a master authenticator, methodical, thorough, and absolutely uncompromising." Her words stayed with me during my drive home. For years, I'd let Ethan's Silicon Valley ambitions overshadow my own expertise, but now, as I looked ahead, I saw nothing but possibilities for my own restoration. A week later, I received a call from Detective Nash, his tone lighter than during our previous conversations. "Miss Crawford, I wanted to let you know we've recovered all but one piece of your collection. The final piece is still being traced, but the majority of your authenticated items are ready for return." Those words felt like successfully closing a major exhibition, the satisfaction of seeing everything return to its proper place. "Thank you, Detective," I said, my voice carrying the warmth of genuine gratitude. "As a curator, I can't express how much this means." "We're just doing our job," he replied, "but I must say, your professional approach to documentation made our work considerably easier. Not everyone maintains such meticulous records." After the call, I went to the precinct to reclaim my recovered pieces. As I held the sapphire ring my grandmother had worn during her curatorial years and the Art Deco bracelet that marked my mother's museum career, I felt a deep sense of restoration. Each piece represented not just monetary value, but a legacy of women who had dedicated their lives to preserving and protecting beautiful things. The day Ethan was formally charged, I received a terse message from him. Was exposing everything really necessary? "Your precious collection is coming back. Hope you're satisfied." I didn't respond. Like a forger confronted with evidence, there was nothing left to say. He had made his choices, and now he was facing the consequences. That evening, I finalized the remaining paperwork with Iris. "Once the divorce is complete, your professional and personal assets will be fully protected," she said. "His startup's collapse won't affect you." "Thank you," I said, feeling the weight lift. "That's exactly what I need." Later that night, sitting in my home office, surrounded by the gradually returning pieces of my collection, I realized how much had changed. The betrayal, the anger, the hurt, they were still there, but like patina on an ancient artifact, they had become part of the story rather than its focus. I'd learned to protect my own legacy with the same dedication I brought to my curatorial work. Autumn called to check in, her voice bright with optimism. "So what's next for Curator Crawford?" she asked. "Honestly," I said, smiling as I adjusted the display of a newly returned piece, "I'm thinking about curating a special exhibition, something about the restoration of lost treasures." As I hung up, I surveyed my home office, now beginning to resemble the carefully curated space it once was. Ethan's betrayal had tested my professional and personal resolve in ways I never expected, but like the artifacts I'd spent my career authenticating and protecting, I had emerged with my own value not just intact, but verified.